Welcome to the channel Liturgy of Slaves. Just after dawn on March 14, 1918, the iron door creaked open in a forgotten corner of Brazos County, Texas. Chained to the stone wall of a crude holding cell on the Wickham plantation, sat three elderly black men. Decades had left their marks upon their bodies, scars layered upon scars, joints swollen from labor that should have ended 53 years earlier when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But here in this humid stretch of Texas farmland, freedom had never arrived. Samuel was 71, Elijah 68, and Moses, the eldest at 74, could barely lift his head anymore. They had been born into slavery, lived through a war that promised liberation, and somehow found themselves right back in chains. Only now the law called it something else: convict leasing, debt peonage, vagrancy, words that white men used to make slavery legal again. That morning, when the farmer's daughter stepped through that door, none of them could have imagined what would happen next. Her presence violated every rule her father had set. Women, especially white women, never entered the cells. Yet there she stood, 17 years old, her hands trembling, her eyes scanning the shadows until they found Moses. And in that single moment, the fragile lies that held that place together began to crack. Before we continue this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Stories like this must never be forgotten. Let's continue. 12 miles outside Bryan, Texas, sat the Wickham farm, surrounded by cotton fields that stretched toward a flat horizon. To anyone passing by on the dusty road, it looked like any other operation in the Brazos Valley. A two-story white house with a wide porch, a barn painted red, though the paint was peeling, and rows of tenant shacks where black families worked the land under arrangements that kept them perpetually indebted. But behind the barn, hidden from the main road, stood a small stone building that had once been a smokehouse. Years earlier, Thomas Wickham had converted it into something else, a private jail. He called the men inside his workers, but they were prisoners. The county sheriff knew about it. The local magistrate had signed the papers. In 1918 Texas, this arrangement was not unusual. After Reconstruction collapsed and federal troops withdrew from the South, white landowners found new ways to control black labor. Arrest a man for standing on the wrong street corner, charge him with vagrancy, fine him an amount he could never pay, then lease his labor to a farmer who would work him until the debt was satisfied, except the debt never was. Fees piled on fees, days turned to months, months to years, and men like Samuel, Elijah, and Moses simply disappeared into the system. Thomas Wickham's daughter, Catherine, had grown up seeing these men from a distance. She knew they were different from the tenant families. They never left the property. They ate separately, slept in the stone building, and worked under the watch of her father or his foreman, a cruel man named Dalton, who carried a leather strap on his belt. Catherine had been taught not to ask questions, but recently something had changed inside her. Moses had arrived at the Wickham place in 1901, 17 years before that morning in March. He had been arrested in Houston for allegedly stealing a pocket watch he never touched. The trial lasted 11 minutes. The judge gave him a choice that was not a choice: pay $1.50 fine plus court costs, or be leased out to a private employer until the debt was worked off. Moses had no $1.50. He had no family to help him, so he was put on a wagon with 8 other men and delivered to Thomas Wickham, who paid the county $12 for the right to Moses's labor. Wickham promised the arrangement would last 6 months. 17 years later, Moses was still there. His hair had gone from gray to white. His back had bent forward from years swinging a hoe and hauling timber. He rarely spoke anymore, even to Samuel and Elijah, the 2 other elderly men who shared his cell. Speech required energy, and energy was a resource he could not afford to waste. He rose before sunrise, worked until his hands bled, ate whatever scraps were thrown to him, and collapsed onto the dirt floor each night. This was his existence. This was all that remained. Samuel and Elijah had similar stories. Samuel had been arrested in 1905 for riding a train without a ticket, though he had been sitting in the colored car where he belonged. The conductor claimed he had no proof of purchase. The fine was $40. Samuel had worked in a mill before his arrest and had saved $23 toward buying a small piece of land. The authorities took that money and applied it to the fine, but it was not enough. The remaining $17 plus fees plus interest became a debt that followed him to the Wickham farm. Elijah's crime had been even more absurd. In 1908, he had argued with a white store clerk over the price of nails. The clerk called the police. Elijah was charged with disorderly conduct and fined $35. He had no money at all. A judge handed him over to Wickham the same week. All three men understood the trap. They were too old to fight, too isolated to escape, and too poor to buy their way out. The law had been designed to recapture them, and it had worked. They had lived through slavery as children, tasted freedom as young men, and been re-enslaved in their old age. The cruelty of it was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and total. Catherine Wickham had turned 17 in February of 1918. She was a thin girl with dark blonde hair that she kept tied back, and eyes that her mother said were too serious for someone her age. She had finished school the year before, and her father expected her to marry soon, preferably to the son of another landowner, someone who could strengthen the family's position in the county. But Catherine had little interest in the social rituals her mother tried to impose. She read books her father disapproved of. She asked questions that made dinner conversations uncomfortable, and lately she had started paying attention to the men in the stone building. It began with small things. She noticed that the men never received medical care, even when one of them was limping badly. She saw Dalton, the foreman, strike Samuel across the shoulders with a stick for moving too slowly. She overheard her father and Dalton laughing one evening about how much work they had squeezed out of the old men that week. Catherine did not understand the full scope of what was happening, but she understood enough to feel sick. One night in early March, she asked her father directly why the men were locked up. Thomas Wickham looked at her with surprise and then irritation. "They're paying off debts," he said flatly. "That's the law." "For how long?" Catherine asked. "As long as it takes." She wanted to ask more, but the look on his face told her the conversation was over. Her mother, sitting nearby with her embroidery, did not even glance up. Catherine went to bed that night unable to sleep. She thought about Moses, the oldest of the three, whose face had become so gaunt that his cheekbones pressed sharply against his skin. She had never spoken to him, but she had seen him in the fields, moving like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Something inside her would not let it go. On the morning of March 14th, Catherine made a decision. Her father had gone into Bryan to meet with a cotton broker, and Dalton had ridden out to the western fields to oversee some clearing work. Her mother was in the house, absorbed in her routines. Catherine waited until she was certain no one was watching, then walked quickly across the yard toward the stone building. Her heart pounded so hard she thought someone might hear it. She had stolen the key from her father's desk the night before. Her hands shook as she fitted it into the heavy iron lock. The door opened with a low groan. The smell hit her first. Sweat, unwashed bodies, damp stone. The light inside was dim, filtering through a single high window covered in grime. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. Then she saw them. 3 men chained to the wall, staring at her with expressions she could not read. Fear, maybe, confusion, or perhaps just exhaustion so deep that nothing surprised them anymore. Moses lifted his head slowly. He looked at this white girl standing in the doorway, and for the first time in years he felt something other than numbness. He felt afraid, not for himself. He had long since stopped fearing what could happen to his body, but he feared what her presence meant. White girls did not come to places like this. If someone found her here, the consequences would not fall on her. They would fall on him, on Samuel, on Elijah. They would be accused of something terrible. They would be killed. Moses tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. "Miss, you shouldn't be here." Catherine stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She looked at the chains, at the thin blankets on the dirt floor, at the wooden bucket in the corner that served as a toilet. Her face went pale. She had known the men were being held, but she had not imagined this. She had pictured something more like the tenant cabins. Poor, yes, but human. This was a cage. "How long have you been here?" she whispered. Moses did not answer. Samuel, sitting against the wall with his wrists shackled, stared at the ground. Elijah's breathing was labored. He had been coughing for weeks, a wet, rattling sound that never stopped. Catherine took another step forward. "I asked how long." Moses finally met her eyes. 17 years, he said. "For me." Samuel, 13. Elijah, 10. Catherine's mouth opened, but no sound came out. 17 years. The number did not make sense. She had been born 17 years ago. This man had been chained here since she was an infant. She looked at the scars on his wrists where the iron had rubbed the skin raw over and over until it had thickened into permanent calluses. She looked at his bare feet, cracked and swollen. She looked at his face, and she saw something she had never allowed herself to see before. She saw her father's work. She saw what her family's comfort had been built on, and she understood, in a way that made her stomach twist, that she had always known. She had just chosen not to look. "I'm going to help you," she said. Moses shook his head slowly. "You can't. I can talk to my father. I can, no." Moses's voice was firmer now, edged with urgency. "Miss, listen to me. You go back to that house. You forget you came here. You do not tell your father. You do not tell anyone. You understand?" "But this is wrong," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "You're old men. You should be dead." Moses interrupted. "We should be dead. That's what men like your father believe. And if you make trouble, if you say one word, we will be. Not right away, maybe, but soon. An accident in the field, a beating that goes too far. It won't matter. We'll be gone, and you'll still be here living in that house, and nothing will change." Catherine felt tears on her face, hot and sudden. She wiped them away with the back of her hand. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Moses looked at her for a long moment. He saw a girl who had just discovered that the world was not what she thought it was. He had seen that look before on the faces of children during the war, when they realized their parents were not coming back. He felt a flicker of pity for her, though he knew he should not. She was still the daughter of the man who owned him. She still had a choice, but she was also 17 years old, and she was crying in a cell that smelled like despair. And maybe that meant something. "You go back," he said quietly. "You live your life, and if you remember us, if you think about what you saw here, maybe one day you do something that matters, but not today. Today, you just go back." Catherine stood there trembling. She wanted to argue. She wanted to unlock the chains right then, to lead them out, to ride into town and demand justice. But she knew Moses was right. She had no power, not really. She was a girl in her father's house, and the world did not listen to girls, especially not when they spoke against their fathers. She nodded slowly, turned, and walked back to the door. Before she left, she looked over her shoulder one last time. "I won't forget," she said. Moses did not respond. He simply closed his eyes as the door shut and the lock clicked into place. The cell returned to darkness. Samuel let out a long breath. "That was dangerous," he said. "I know," Moses replied. "What do you think she'll do?" "Nothing," Moses said, "same as everyone else." But he was wrong. Catherine Wickham did not do nothing. She did something far more dangerous than Moses could have imagined. She started writing it all down. Every detail she could remember, every name, every date, every cruelty she had seen or overheard. She hid the pages under the floorboards in her room, and she kept adding to them week after week, building a record that would one day become evidence. She did not know yet what she would do with it, but she knew she could not let it disappear into silence. That was how it began, a girl opening a door, 3 men telling her to leave, and a choice made in the dark to remember. The days that followed were unbearable for Catherine. She moved through the routines of her life, helping her mother with the house, attending church on Sunday, smiling politely when neighbors visited. But inside she felt as though something had split open. She could not stop thinking about Moses and the others. At dinner, when her father complained about the cost of feed or the weather affecting the cotton, she had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. She watched him cut his meat, sip his wine, laugh at his own jokes, and all she could see was the iron around Moses's wrists. Her mother noticed the change. One afternoon as they sat together mending clothes, she asked Catherine if something was troubling her. Catherine wanted to tell her. She wanted to say, "Mother, do you know what Father is doing? Do you know there are men chained in that building, men who have been there for years?" But she remembered Moses's warning. She remembered the fear in his eyes, so she lied. She said she was tired. That was all. Her mother patted her hand and told her to get more rest. The conversation ended. Catherine went back to her sewing, her needle moving in and out of the fabric, and she hated herself for staying silent. Thomas Wickham had built his wealth slowly, carefully, over 2 decades. He was not a plantation owner in the old sense. He did not have hundreds of acres or dozens of enslaved people. But he had learned how to work the system that replaced slavery, how to exploit the laws that allowed him to acquire black labor for almost nothing. Convict leasing was his primary method, but he also used debt peonage, trapping tenant farmers in cycles of loans they could never repay. He was respected in Bryan, served on the board of the local bank, and attended the Baptist church every Sunday. People saw him as a successful farmer, a man who had worked hard and earned what he had. They did not see the stone building. They did not ask questions, and if they heard rumors, they dismissed them. This was Texas in 1918. The Confederacy had lost the war, but it had won the peace. White supremacy was not just an idea. It was the law enforced by sheriffs and judges and lawmakers who believed, truly believed, that black people existed to serve white people. Men like Thomas Wickham did not think of themselves as evil. They thought of themselves as practical. Dalton, the foreman, was different. He enjoyed the cruelty. Wickham saw the men as tools, assets to be used until they broke. But Dalton saw them as things he could hurt without consequence. He had grown up poor, the son of a failed farmer, and he resented the world for it. The only power he had ever known was the power to inflict pain on people who could not fight back. He carried that leather strap on his belt not because he needed it for discipline, but because he liked the way it felt in his hand. He liked the sound it made. He liked watching men flinch. Moses had learned to avoid Dalton's attention. He kept his head down, worked without complaint, and tried to become invisible. But invisibility was hard when your body was failing. Moses's knees had been giving him trouble for months. Some mornings he could barely stand. Dalton noticed. One afternoon in late March, he ordered Moses to carry a load of cut timber from the woods to the barn. The distance was nearly half a mile. The wood was green and heavy. Moses tried. He lifted the bundle, felt his knees buckle, and dropped it. Dalton walked over slowly. "Pick it up," he said. Moses bent down, gripped the wood again, and tried to lift. His legs would not hold. He fell forward, landing hard on his hands. Dalton kicked him in the ribs. Not hard enough to break anything, but hard enough to hurt. I said, "Pick it up." Moses tried again. And again, each time his body failed him, each time Dalton kicked him. Samuel and Elijah, working nearby, kept their eyes down. They had learned long ago that intervening only made things worse. Finally, Dalton grew bored. He told Moses to get up and get back to the cell. Moses crawled part of the way before he could stand. That night, he lay on the dirt floor, his ribs aching, his breath shallow, and he wondered how much longer his body would last. He did not fear death. He feared dying here in this place without ever seeing the sky as a free man again. Catherine had been watching from the house. She saw Dalton kick Moses. She saw her father, standing near the barn, turn away as if he had not noticed. She felt rage rise in her chest, hot and choking. That night, she added another page to her hidden record. She described what she had seen. She wrote Dalton's name. She wrote the date. She was building something, though she still did not know what it would become. She only knew that silence felt like complicity, and she could not bear that weight anymore, but writing was not enough. She needed to do something more. She needed to act. And so, against every instinct that told her to stay safe, she began to plan. There was a lawyer in Bryan named Howard Pierce. Catherine had heard her father mention him once dismissively as a man who took cases no one else would touch. He had represented a black family in a land dispute the previous year, and though he had lost, the fact that he had tried at all made him unusual. Catherine did not know if he would help her, but he was the only person she could think of who might. The problem was getting to him without her father finding out. She could not simply ride into town alone. That would raise questions. She needed a reason, a cover. It took her 2 weeks to create one. She told her mother she wanted to visit a friend in Bryan, a girl named Mary Sutton, whose family attended the same church. Her mother agreed, pleased that Catherine was finally showing interest in socializing. On April 2nd, Catherine took the buggy into town. She stopped at Mary's house first, stayed for half an hour to make the visit believable, then excused herself, saying she needed to pick up some fabric at the general store. Instead, she walked 3 blocks to Howard Pierce's office, a small room above a drugstore. Her heart hammered as she climbed the narrow stairs. She knocked. A voice told her to come in. Howard Pierce was in his mid-40s, balding, with tired eyes and ink stains on his fingers. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see a young white woman standing in his doorway. "Can I help you?" he asked. Catherine closed the door behind her. She had rehearsed what she would say, but now that she was here, the words felt inadequate. She took a breath and began. "My name is Catherine Wickham. My father owns a farm outside town. He's holding 3 men prisoner, elderly men, black men. They've been there for years, chained up, forced to work. I need your help." Pierce stared at her. He sat down his pen slowly. "Sit down," he said. Catherine sat. She told him everything. The stone building, the chains, Moses, Samuel, Elijah. The debts that never ended, Dalton's violence, her father's indifference. She spoke quickly, afraid that if she stopped, she would lose her nerve. When she finished, Pierce leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "Miss Wickham," he said carefully, "what you're describing is not uncommon. Convict leasing, debt peonage, these practices are legal in Texas, or at least they're not prosecuted. But it's wrong." Catherine said. "Wrong and illegal are not always the same thing," Pierce replied. "Your father has contracts. He has agreements with the county. If I try to challenge this, I'll lose, and worse, I'll make enemies who can destroy my practice. So you won't help." Pierce looked at her for a long moment. He saw a girl who still believed the world could be fair if you just pushed hard enough. He envied her that innocence, even as he knew it would not last. "I didn't say that," he said quietly. "I said it's complicated. If you want to help these men, you need evidence, real evidence, documents, contracts, testimony, and you need to be prepared for what will happen when you go up against your father, because he will fight you, and you will lose things, maybe everything." Catherine met his eyes. "I know," she said. "Do you?" Pierce asked. "Because once you start this, you can't stop. Your family will turn on you. Your friends will abandon you. This town will call you a traitor. Are you ready for that?" Catherine thought about Moses lying on that dirt floor, his ribs bruised, his body breaking. She thought about 17 years in chains. She thought about all the ways she had been complicit by staying silent. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Pierce nodded slowly. "All right then, let's see what we can do." They worked together over the following weeks. Catherine brought him the pages she had written, the detailed record of everything she had seen and heard. Pierce reviewed them, made notes, and began to build a case. He explained that their best chance was not through the local courts, which were controlled by men like Thomas Wickham, but through federal authorities. There were laws against peonage, against holding people in involuntary servitude. They were rarely enforced, especially in the South, but they existed. If they could get the attention of someone in the Justice Department, someone who cared, they might have a chance. It was a long shot, but it was something. Catherine continued her double life, At home, she played the dutiful daughter. At secret meetings with Pierce, she became something else, a witness, an informer, a betrayer of her own blood. The tension was unbearable. She barely slept. She lost weight. Her mother asked again if she was ill. Her father, distracted by his business, barely noticed, and in the stone building, Moses, Samuel, and Elijah continued to suffer, unaware that anyone was fighting for them. Then, in early May, everything changed. Dalton found Catherine's hiding place. She had been careless. She had left one of the floorboards slightly loose, and Dalton, doing some repair work in the house, noticed it. He pried it up and found the pages. He did not read them himself. He could barely read, but he took them to Thomas Wickham. Wickham read them in his study, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he called for Catherine. She came downstairs, saw the pages spread across his desk, and felt the floor drop out from under her. Her father did not yell. That would have been easier. Instead, he spoke in a low, cold voice that she had never heard before. "You've been writing about me," he said. Catherine said nothing. "You've been meeting with Howard Pierce." Still nothing. "You've been plotting to destroy this family." Catherine found her voice. "I've been trying to free 3 men who shouldn't be in chains." Thomas Wickham stood up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, and in that moment, Catherine saw him as the men in the stone building must have seen him, as someone with absolute power over their lives. "Those men are criminals," he said. "They owe debts. I'm simply enforcing the law." "For 17 years, Catherine's voice shook. "You've kept Moses for 17 years for a debt that started at $50. That's not the law, that's slavery." Her father slapped her. It was not a hard blow, but it was sudden, and Catherine staggered back, her hand going to her cheek. Her mother, standing in the doorway, gasped but did not intervene. Thomas Wickham pointed at the pages. "You will stop this," he said. "You will go to Pierce and tell him you made a mistake. You will recant everything, and you will never speak of this again." Catherine felt tears on her face, but she did not look away. "No," she said. Her father's expression shifted. She saw something flicker there, surprise maybe, or the beginning of real anger. "If you do not do as I say," he said slowly, "I will have those men killed. Tonight, Dalton will take care of it. It will look like an accident, and it will be your fault." Catherine felt the room spin. She had known her father was capable of cruelty, but this was something else. This was a threat so monstrous that it took her breath away. And she knew he meant it. She could see it in his eyes. If she continued, Moses, Samuel, and Elijah would die. She would be the cause of their deaths. The weight of that knowledge crushed her. She stood there silent, trapped between 2 impossible choices. And in that silence, Thomas Wickham smiled. "I thought so," he said. He gathered up the pages and threw them into the fireplace. They caught quickly, curling and blackening as the flames consumed them. "You're a foolish girl," he said. "But you're my daughter. I'll forgive this once. You'll stay in this house. You'll not go to town. You'll not see Pierce again. And we will never speak of this again." Catherine watched her words burn. She watched months of work turn to ash, and she realized in that moment that she had lost. She had tried to fight and she had failed. Her father was too powerful. The system was too strong. And she was just a girl with no real power at all. She nodded, barely a movement, and turned to leave. But as she walked away, something hardened inside her. Her father thought he had won. He thought she would obey. But Catherine Wickham had learned something in these past weeks. She had learned that silence was a choice, and she was done choosing it. She did not know yet what she would do, but she knew she would do something, even if it cost her everything. That night, Catherine did not sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying her father's threat over and over in her mind. Asterisk, he would kill them if she pushed further. Asterisk, if she went back to Pierce, if she made any move at all, Moses, Samuel, and Elijah would die, and it would be her fault. The logic was airtight, the trap perfect. Her father had found the one thing that would paralyze her, not fear for herself, but fear for them. She thought about Moses's face when he had told her to go back to the house, to forget what she had seen. He had known this would happen. He had lived long enough to understand how power worked, how white men protected their interests, how girls like her, no matter how well intentioned, could not win against the machinery of oppression. But lying there in the dark, Catherine realized something else. Her father's threat only worked if he knew what she was doing. If she acted in secret, if she moved carefully, if she was willing to risk everything without his knowledge, then maybe she could still do something. It was a desperate thought, reckless and dangerous, but it was the only thought she had left. The next morning, Catherine behaved exactly as her father expected. She stayed in the house, she helped her mother with breakfast, she did not mention Pierce or the burned pages or the men in the stone building. Thomas Wickham watched her carefully for the first few days, but when she continued to play the obedient daughter, he relaxed. He believed he had broken her, that was his mistake. Catherine waited 2 weeks. She needed her father to believe the threat had worked, that she had given up. During those 2 weeks, she reconstructed everything she could remember from the pages that had burned. She wrote it down again, this time in smaller handwriting on thinner paper, and she hid it in a different place, sewn into the lining of an old coat in the back of her closet. She also made a decision. She could not go to Pierce again. Her father would be watching for that. But she could write to someone else, someone outside Brazos County, someone her father could not control. There was a federal prosecutor in Houston named Robert Harmon. Catherine had read about him in the newspaper. He had prosecuted several cases involving peonage and forced labor, and he had won some of them. He was one of the few federal officials who seemed to care about enforcing the laws that were supposed to protect black workers from re-enslavement. Catherine did not know if he would take her seriously, but she had to try. She wrote him a letter. It was 3 pages long, carefully composed, detailing everything she knew about her father's operation. She included names, dates, descriptions of the conditions in the stone building. She explained the convict leasing contracts, the debts that never ended, the violence Dalton inflicted. At the end, she wrote, "I am risking my life to send you this. If my father discovers what I have done, he will kill the men I am trying to save. Please help them. Please do not let this continue." She signed it with her full name. Then she faced the problem of how to mail it without her father knowing. Catherine's solution was simple, but required perfect timing. Her mother made a weekly trip to the post office in Bryan to collect mail and send letters. Catherine offered to go with her, saying she wanted to pick up some thread at the general store. Her mother, pleased by the gesture, agreed. On May 22nd, they rode into town together. While her mother was inside the post office, Catherine slipped her letter into the outgoing mail slot, addressed to Robert Harmon in Houston. Her hands shook as she did it. Once the letter was gone, there was no taking it back. She had just set something in motion that she could not control. She climbed back into the buggy, her heart pounding, and rode home with her mother, making small talk about the weather and the garden, and nothing that mattered. When they arrived back at the farm, Catherine went to her room and waited. All she could do now was hope that Harmon would read her letter, believe it, and act. Days passed, then a week, then 2. Catherine heard nothing. She began to wonder if the letter had even reached him, or if he had read it and dismissed it as the ramblings of a hysterical girl. She tried to maintain her composure, but the waiting was agony. Meanwhile, conditions in the stone building grew worse. Elijah's cough had turned into something more serious. He was feverish, delirious at times, and Moses and Samuel could hear him struggling to breathe at night. They begged Dalton to bring a doctor. He laughed and said doctors cost money and sick workers were not worth the expense. Elijah died on June 8, 1918. He simply stopped breathing in the middle of the night. Moses woke to the sound of silence where Elijah's rattling breath had been. He reached out in the darkness and felt Elijah's body, still warm but utterly still. Moses did not cry. He had no tears left. He just sat there, his hand on Elijah's shoulder, until the sun came up. When Dalton unlocked the door that morning and saw the body, he cursed. Not because a man had died, but because it meant paperwork. He dragged Elijah's body out by the ankles and threw it onto a cart. Moses and Samuel watched through the small window as Dalton drove the cart toward the back of the property, to a spot near the tree line where the soil was soft. That was where they buried the men who died on the Wickham farm. No markers, no ceremony, just shallow graves that would be forgotten within a generation. Catherine saw the cart from her bedroom window. She did not know who had died, but she knew what it meant. One of the 3 men was gone. She felt a scream building in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She could not afford to break. Not now, not when she was still waiting for Harmon to respond. That afternoon, she went to the stone building. It was a reckless thing to do, but she needed to know. She waited until her father and Dalton were both out in the fields. Then she took the key from her father's desk and unlocked the door. Inside, she found Moses and Samuel, still chained, still alive, but hollowed out by grief. Moses looked up at her with eyes that held no hope. "Elijah's dead," he said simply. Catherine felt the words like a physical blow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Why are you here?" Samuel asked. His voice was flat, empty. "You can't help us. You already tried." "I'm still trying," Catherine said. "I wrote to a federal prosecutor. I'm waiting to hear back." Moses shook his head slowly. "Even if he comes, even if he believes you, we'll be dead before anything changes. Your father won't let us be taken. You understand that, don't you? He'll kill us first." Catherine wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Her father would not allow federal authorities to expose him. He would destroy the evidence, and the evidence was Moses and Samuel. She stood there, helpless and furious, and she made a decision. "Then I'll get you out myself," she said. Moses stared at her. "What?" "I'll get you out tonight. I'll unlock the chains and you'll run. You'll go north, find somewhere safe, and I'll deal with my father, Miss Catherine." Moses said carefully, "If we run, they'll come after us. They'll hunt us down, and when they catch us, they'll hang us. That's what happens to black men who run. Then you run far enough that they can't catch you." Catherine said, her voice rising. "You run and you don't stop, and you get free, because staying here is just dying slowly." Samuel looked at Moses. Something passed between them. Some unspoken communication forged over years of shared suffering. Finally, Moses spoke. "All right," he said. "We'll try." Catherine felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. She was about to commit an act that would destroy her family, put herself in danger, and possibly get Moses and Samuel killed. But doing nothing was no longer an option. She told them she would come back after midnight, when everyone was asleep. She would bring tools to break the chains if she could not find the key to the shackles. She would bring food and water for their journey. And she would open the door and let them go. Moses nodded. He did not thank her. Words like that felt meaningless in the face of what they were about to attempt. Catherine left the building, locked the door behind her, and returned the key to her father's desk. Then she went to her room and began to plan. Midnight came slowly. Catherine lay in bed, fully clothed, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Her parents had gone to bed hours earlier. The farm was silent except for the usual night sounds: crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind moving through the trees. Catherine waited until she was certain everyone was asleep. Then she crept downstairs. She had gathered supplies earlier and hidden them under her bed. A small sack of bread and dried meat, a canteen of water, a hammer and chisel she had taken from the barn. She carried these things out the back door, moving as quietly as she could. The night was warm and moonless. She crossed the yard toward the stone building, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. Moses and Samuel were waiting, awake, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. "We're ready," Moses said. Catherine knelt beside him and examined the shackles. They were locked with a small padlock, and she did not have the. Thanks for watching, and subscribe my channel.